Good. So we would start by and in the order of things today, I'll maybe ask you to read something first, which is connected with much of the dialogue that is connected to our conversation on India, particularly in its post liberalization period, which is the post. So the 1990s become a very important period. So let me start by doing first a quick recap, and then maybe it's better that you focus on these two very interesting readings. In fact, the only texts that make an effort in my sort of limited understanding of whatever is available on the Indian economy. There's always a lot of information, but what I've been made aware of over the years is that there's a lot of discussion on the macro, that is the larger picture of the Indian economy post independence, but not much has been written about the trajectory of states. That is the like you have provincial networks in the Canadian context and states in the US. In the Indian context as well, the journey of states is quite different from the macro picture. And in fact, the nature of economic change and social change experienced by states is happening at a completely different timeline based on the national trajectory. A lot of things at the national level happen or start changing in terms of progressive realization of higher growth or better developmental prospects post 1990s or from early 1990s, while in the context of some states, particularly down south or in the east or right up in the hill states of the north, you will find that the trajectory is changing at different periods of time in the 1970s, 80s itself, largely due to the politics of the state, a politics of social mobilization, access to better education. So it depends a lot on the state leadership, a lot depends a lot on the nature of resources made available to these states, but also a lot of the states which are the most populous states in India, the state of Uttar Pradesh, that is northern provinces. Then you have states like Bihar, Bengal, Punjab. Most of these states, which are the larger populous states, they don't see much of change economically speaking for a larger period of time. Um, and it's only after the early 90s or mid 90s that things start improving in their economic growth prospects. What you would find is a scenario of a greater semblance of economic policies at the national level catering to the needs of these states as well. So, what you would find uh, is quite interestingly uh, the period of post-colonial India, I mean 1947 to 64, where I discussed in the recording the emphasis of a Soviet style model of heavy state engineered public investment in infrastructural development and anchored while private capital mobility was not encouraged. Um, you have the period of time between 1964 to 1980 when much of the East Asian economies were growing, opening up for greater export-oriented industrialization. You have examples from South Korea, to a lot of extent, smaller countries like Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, all of these sort of opening up for greater export-oriented industrialization. You, in the Indian context, you see the quite opposite. It becomes, in fact, even more insulated and conservative in its economic ideology, and the larger adaptation of socialist economic ideological measures took the government far extremely far left of the economic center, and the agenda saw greater nationalization of Indian banks, insurance companies. You have a lot of political instability in this period of time. So clearly, a lot of the positive momentum, which one could say was built between 47 and 64 as a foundational sort of set of years, that aspect is more or less lost. The period of time of the 1970s often is also called the lost decade in the context of the Indian story. Post 1980, however, if you see, there's a marked shift in the adoption of or the adoption of what you would consider as first signals of business measures in economic reform. There is, with the change in leadership, as Indira Gandhi's son Rajiv Gandhi. So the three main figures, right, in leadership that spoken of in the recording here, that is Jawaharlal Nehru, who's the first prime minister and a chief architect of also the Indian National Congress during the nationalism movement. He's sort of the prodigy of uh, Mahatma Gandhi, who was sort of seen as India's sort of main principal designer of the nationalism movement when he came back from South Africa to India. Apart from many other, of course, nationalist leaders, Nehru's sort of uncontested rule between 47 and 64 sees a couple of wars. You also have a period of time between 64 and 1980 when tensions with Pakistan rise, particularly which leads to a war again and the formation of Bangladesh. This is when Nehru's daughter Indira Gandhi is in power at three different intervals, and all of those intervals, or each of those intervals, are very, very, um, um, I would say, tumultuous with political instability and also the nature of economic challenges that India was facing at that time. 1980 to 88, you have the assassination of Indira Gandhi, and that leads to the sort of her son coming into power, who is Rajiv Gandhi. And Rajiv Gandhi is seen as more of a sort of a young leader, modernist, relaxes a lot of controls, regulations on capital mobility from the external markets. So you have a shift, which is a pro-business shift in economic policy. In fact, the reading you would just look at in a while from now talks about this is in quite detail. And I think that's very important because there is the 1990s and then the pre-1990s, and very little is said of what are the nature of moderate changes in the 1980s, the late 1980s, that actually allowed for the Big Bang reforms that happened in early 1991. Now, what happened in 1991, as I mentioned in the recording, was India faced a balance of payment crisis. In a classical sense, a balance of payment crisis means that you're finding it difficult to pay for your imports. Your foreign currency reserves, as in terms of dollar or gold, are at its lowest level. Most of these scenarios happen when you don't have too much of private capital investment or private investment coming from abroad or foreign companies. It may be through to a bunch of factors. Your macroeconomic performance of the economy may not be very well. Your policies may be very resistant to foreign capital coming. India, for much of its post-independent history, was very hesitant and resistant of private foreign capital because of its colonial past and also what it experienced under the British Empire. And that made the economic ideology, the dominant economic ideology, to be much more socialist and resistant of sort of foreign capital mobility. But what it did at the end of the day, it put enormous pressure on the government, whether it was on education, healthcare, nutrition, maintaining price stability. Everything was expected from the state or the government. And that led to a massive fiscal crisis in the economy. So, government being in more or less debt, heavily dependent on foreign aid, uh, foreign currency reserves not being at an optimal level, a lot of those crisis indicators led to a sudden change in what you would find or experience and explain as the crisis of 1991. Now, the World Bank was requested for a loan, and this is the time of the Washington Consensus, advising for opening up of markets through liberalization, privatization, globalization, the LPG acronym, across sectors. India did not just open up radically to do to for investment needs, but it did so across different sectors. And as it did, those pro-market reforms allowed for greater capital mobility. So one big area is, of course, automobile. Another big area being information communication technology, which, as you know, created the whole rise of the service sector in the Indian urban spaces. You have scenarios of a greater development of the software development market, big multinational companies investing in India. So a lot of that change and churn in the 90s saw the rise of the cities in that regard. So you have a scenario where a lot of the change in the 90s creates also its own nature of new challenges. The agricultural sector, the manufacturing sector gets more or less ignored in the development and policy reform trajectory. We don't see land reforms or labor reforms at the same level as we see in terms of, let's say, the opening up of sectors for investment. So that, of course, creates its own challenges, and those challenges are most starkly experienced by states which are heavily dependent otherwise on agriculture, uh, uh, which allow for many of its workforce who are dependent on agricultural needs to be finding themselves suddenly not able to contribute to the national growth picture. It still is the case, as I said, through the data that you must have seen, 46 to 47% of India's maximum workforce population is still, as we speak, dependent on agriculture. In fact, those numbers, if the latest census would come out in the next year or two, might be much, much more, as a lot of people speculate in the current scheme of things. So, what I would advise you to do is, before I sort of move forward in looking at the context of the nature of macroeconomic challenges, the two texts, which are a two-part series on the political economy landscape in India's sort of growth picture, talking more or less about the 1980s and 1990s, is something that I would advise you to first read. It will give you a good background context. If you've already done so, then you could look at India, the Emerging Giant, that is Arvind Panagria's group, talking about the same period. He does so much more with a sort of industrial policy sort of outlook. But this particular text by Atul Kohli talks very clearly about the nature of policy shift, policy ideological shift, and how does it impact and affect states in India, which, as I said, is not extensively talked about. It also helps you understand and look at the dualities in India's growth trajectory. It is one of the, in the top three right now, one of the most unequal countries with respect to wealth inequality and disparity, with the recent numbers on inequality coming out. And there's been a huge policy debate around these issues. A few of us have been writing on the subject for some time now. So to understand those dualities, I feel these two texts, I think, do a reasonably good job. So I'd like you to look at the text first. I'll move forward then in talking about much of the nature of challenges. Some of these were discussed in brief in our last recording, but we focus more on employment and gender as issues as we move forward. So if I can request you, maybe just utilize the next sort of 30 minutes or so to read through these two parts. They're not very extensive reads, reasonably short in length because there are commentaries from a research magazine. But as you read through it, just try to make sense of what Kohli is saying on the nature of policy, ideological shift taking place, and how does that affect states. Okay. I'll just share with you the link again of these texts so that you don't have problem accessing them. They're in the course readings folder. Uh, that's reading one. Then reading two, which, yeah. So I'll just request you to go through these two texts, and then let me move forward with our conversation on the nature of macro challenges that the uh, economy faces. Mm, okay. If you face, I mean, some of you or any of you face any questions as you go through the text, just use the chat box and write to me separately. Yeah? Thank you. Let's get started, please. All right. Any any observations from the text? I mean, part one in particular talks about the 1980s. There's a very interesting distinction in this text, the first part, which talks about the reference to pro-business and pro-market policies or approaches. Anything to reflect on that based on what you would have read? And then we could look at part two then, and that same reference. Okay, let me see if I can pull out each of the readings. Yeah. Yeah. Anyone? Yes, Peter? Hi.
Yeah, I thought the distinction was interesting between, being pro business in general, being pro market versus being pro just certain businesses and practicing that sort of, favoritism, that sort of interventionism.
So how does this play in context to the 1980s scenario? What particular reflections has the author offered in context to states in India during that period? Anything striking? Anything? Yeah, Ikram, hi, please.
So what I understood is that the state, some states, well, the Indian strategy was to move from a pro-market strategy to a pro-business strategy. So the states that supported and adopted this strategy were able to develop and so prosperity. Well, other states who were not able to adopt the pro-business strategy, as in supporting big businesses with different strategies, were not able to develop. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, anyone else? Yes, Francia? Hi.
Yeah, it seemed to me that there was a transition where there was more government influence in the market and regulations in the investments. And then there was a shift from the government being more proactive to businesses being more aggressive and entering the market and sort of developing the economy, which, if I understood well, it opened up the path for a lot of elitists and people and business owners to become very wealthy in certain regions and develop those regions, but it also created some social inequalities because of that.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so that in fact is a very critical aspect of understanding how the embrace of supply side, or what is popularly defined as neoliberal economic policies, did in the Indian context was to exacerbate existing social and economic inequalities. Um, and a lot of that effect was experienced in reference to how and the extent to which state intervention happened in its own form across different states in India. You have the nation state, which is sort of at a macro level, policy changes happening, and a different uh, adoption of that change of the national sort of embrace of neoliberal economic policies at the state level. So many states, in fact, don't. Uh, I mean, you have example from states like West Bengal, which is the bordering state to Bangladesh. Um, then in the south, you'd have states like Kerala, which perform perhaps the best on human development indicators in the national context. But when it comes to any change in industrial policy or encouraging private investment within these states, each of these states, predominantly due to a state ideological reason, did not make those changes despite what happened in the early 90s. And the move which is spoken by the author, and I think the distinction between business and pro market state intervention, I think theoretically speaking, makes a lot of sense in context to most emerging market economies. You know, the explanation on how a country A or B actually becomes, you know, accessible or available on a high growth path, or how does the experience of, let's say, one country over the other provides a model for others to replicate. Like, I mean, the export oriented industrialization of the East Asian economies were path dependent to what Japan did in much of its sort of early, mid, and late 20th century. South Korea followed in a lot of sense the Japanese model. It did have its sort of colonial linkages, but in terms of approach in the 1960s, you have Park Chung-hee and others sort of really pushing for a militant authoritarian I mean a regime ap- approaching economic reform, uh, which is heavily dependent on export oriented industrialization, and that was trying to sort of as much as possible align itself to Japan. You have Taiwan then, very similar. If you were to travel to Taiwan or spend some time in Taiwan, and particularly in its capital, Taipei and others, most people, as you would talk to them about the history of reforms in and the nature of change and technological advancement, is accredited to a sort of a linkage with what Japan has been doing. Singapore also, to a certain extent, had that acknowledgement. So why this factor is very critical is because the adoption of the kind of state intervention has a link or an influential link with another um, uh, economy, either in the regional sphere or just in some cases in the ideological sphere of countries, which are aspiring for making those changes. So in the Indian scenarios, you see the 1980s, particularly the Rajiv Gandhi tenure between 1984 to 89, 90, that those 6 years are part of what would be seen as pro-business governments, a government which is trying to undertake certain changes in order to enable businesses to do greater uh, uh, m- investment in certain markets. I mean, you have the one of the bigger booming markets around that period, which was emerging, and unfortunately, that comparative strength India lost was the hardware market. Very few people generally know that India was sort of a leading manufacturer of assembled goods. In fact, for a lot of people like us, when our first computer that we used was an assembled computer where the CPU was from another company, the keyboard was from another company, and India did very well in sort of assembling goods. It was that sort of, I think, engineering um, comparative advantage, which allowed the automobile sector later in the 90s to become, in terms of its semi-automotive component parts and assembling process, a leading sector in the Indian economy. Um, and a lot of that change was happening because of the nature of changing state intervention towards pro-business and pro-market policies. So the distinction the author here, I mean, Kohli draws between how pro-market regimes work versus pro-business regimes is, I feel, a very useful theoretical and normative sort of framework in understanding how countries work. The Canadian context, I have mostly argued in my limited observation, but whatever I see of it across sectors is that it resembles, if we were to use Kohli's sort of framework of assessment, a more pro-business outlook in many of its sectors. One of the reasons that it represents a sort of an oligopolistic cartel in certain, with limited sellers in different and across sectors, from aviation to retail to others. You'll find that that represents a pro-business rather than a pro-market outlook. Pro-market outlook or approach would encourage a relatively freer entry and exit of firms. Reforms would be more on terms of trying to promote competition between firms and avoiding any dominant share of ownership or distribution amongst any firms that are dominant in the market. So it's this, the first particular reading, I think, tries to give that reference point or a framework which is very important. You have uh, a discussion then on how Indira Gandhi was sort of moving away from socialism or the failures of the 1970s model of India's sort of economic growth trajectory. I mean, just apart from the fact that it was a constitutional emergency, much of the economic reforms undertaken between 1964 and 1980 were were seen anti-industrial, in the sense of not encouraging private capital at all, constraining uh, capital mobility, or reform in terms of private ownership or expansion of business through extensive regulations and permits. And that bureaucratized the Indian state to that possible extent that things, it became virtually impossible to do business in India. I mean, Coca-Cola, I think, had entered the Indian market around much so in, I think, the late 1960s, but went out of the Indian market, in fact, and it was seen as a big sort of disincentivizing factor for other international businesses. They had to come back in later in the 90s when uh, it was a different India at that time. You have a discussion on annual growth rates and things like that. I mean, figure 4 does that in context to the uh, part 1 of the reading. It gives you a sense of the distinction between overall performance in growth through net domestic product and other sort of indicators. Um, Generally, worker productivity in India, and I'll talk a little bit about this now, has not been that high. I mean, in fact, Indian workers, if you compare it to, in broader sense, I mean, South Asian workers, but if you look at the workforce labor productivity rate, how many in terms of manufacturing or any sector, Indian workers or South Asian workers have performed much on a lower sort of productive scale across the board over the last 30 to 40 years. On the contrary, if you look at um, workers from China and previously from, Japan, and again recently in case of South Korea, their performance in case of labor productivity measures would be much, much better. And one of the big reasons for that improvement in performance is the relative investment in human capital development, not just education, but also in terms of skills, vocational training. So it's not about just educating an individual and letting him or her find a job. The idea is to sort of create institutional mechanisms for vocational training where when you are in a job, you can still find ways to sort of get more value added skills, and then you're able to sort of improve upon your productive contributions in the economy over a period of time. And I think this while there is a lot of critique, I mean, on productivity and emphasis on production, I feel that that debate, as much as important as that may be, I mean, in context to, say, talking about environmental change or pollution or climate change, the emphasis on production and productivity is of essential need for a broader well-being enhancement and realization of human development potential. I think that over a period of time has been a major limitation or challenge for many of the um, countries, and for those countries that have not fully realized their sort of development potential or have not seen better performance in nutrition, literacy rates, let's say infant mortality, and indicators that are very basic to a development story. Talking about, and I think sort of deproduction metric focused views on development is, I mean, it's quite ambitious to be speaking of that. Clearly, because I mean, generally at the end of the day, it is the average contributions of the workforce which make them to earn more money, and that they're able to utilize for their towards their own well-being. Driving someone in poverty or letting them to be made comfortable in their own poverty is rather not the way you would want countries to sort of even deal with issues as pressing as they may be. So it's very interesting to sort of compare a performance of workers across countries which are at a similar level of development, perhaps in the 1970s, 80s. And you see that, I mean, when we'll talk about China, which is something we start doing from the next class, you'll see that Chinese context is extremely different when it comes to how the Deng Xiaoping reforms of the late 1970s and brought a huge impetus on pro-market approach to economic growth and development. And that pro-market approach, while it did not embrace private capital investment into China, made the Chinese institutions very wary of competition with external institutions, industries, and developing themselves in a manner that not only all domestic demand needs were met in basic essentials, but also China could become more and more competitive. I can give one example, which is with reference to the China. I mean, in my own experience of seeing China work on something it was not good at, let's say 10 years back, and now it is one of the sort of leading countries in that area. And there are in fact two examples. One would be its universities. I mean, 10 years, 12 years back, Chinese universities were not part of any major rankings. I mean, there are a lot of issues with rankings, of course, and I've also written about these on how they are gamed in many higher education performance metrics. But if you were to sort of leave the critique on rankings aside and just see some of the aspects being vital to understanding how universities are being growing, research, teaching, and other institutional sort of development needs. Chinese universities, barring a few like Peking and Tsinghua, they were not anywhere to be seen in global performative metrics. And I think the state became conscious of this, that if it wants to continue growing as an economy, its focus on higher education and human capital development, skilling, most of these have to be their primary importance. And a huge amount of political capital was invested in sort of developing access to resources for institutions in developing these. And you have a situation now that I think more than 2025 major institutions are now part of global rankings, at least in areas of science and research. Now, there are issues with that performative level as well, because how you're able to manage and get those institutions to perform. But I think with that political will, it just, and when I visited China, around 3 universities or 4 universities from Yunnan to, I mean, outside Beijing and Shanghai area, I'm just sort of talking about other tier 2, tier 3 cities. One could see the kind of confidence the university leadership felt in the kind of capital and space that was allowed. Um, in context of science, particularly science research and development. At the same level, in the Indian scenario, we had just recently a very interesting talk by this political economist Deepak Nair, whose name is also mentioned in these two-part chapters. Um, that the crisis in India's sort of economic performance right now is a function, as a direct function of its crisis in the higher education sector. It's just completely, the higher educational scene has been abandoned or forsaken of sorts by the state, and it's all dependent now on private universities, which have their own rent-seeking sort of function and goals. Yes, Francia, please. Sorry, you had raised your hand. I wanted to comment.
Yeah, I think just to add a little bit to that, just to bring it to more current times, one thing that, speaking of China, and I think that nations more than now are very resilient, and we're seeing a tremendous shift on world economies and globalization because of what's happening with Trump and the Trump administration. And what was a shock to a lot of people is that you have 3 countries, which is South Korea, Japan, and China, and they could not be more different. They've been at war for centuries. They were at war for centuries. They disagree on everything. And they just agree on a free trade agreement, a trilateral free trade agreement
Yeah,
to
yeah.
accommodate for the Trump shock. So that's like huge. And then currently you have Canada advocating with the leading for the Commonwealth trade agreements. And then you have the EU. So it's very, very interesting times. But since you're mentioning China and China's economic development and so on, I think this is like another example of like their resiliency to even like agree to work with countries that they always had animosity between and disagreements to accommodate for economic health.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, the current scenario, if I were to sort of just probably bring the timeline to the nature of seismic, I think, shifts that were so critical in the emergence of, I mean, let's say China and India and the global economic story in the 90s. Um, their sort of rise at the global leadership level perhaps is being anticipated. I mean, particularly in the China context now. They were seen as emerging players then, who were sort of the new kids on the block arriving with sort of great potential. China just clearly overtakes most countries then in that regard. I mean, the most amazing thing about I mean, as far as the many things that there are issues internally and externally in the way the Chinese politics have has sort of worked on many areas, and but what one has to sort of acknowledge is the fact that it's perhaps the only country on the planet that was able to abjectly eradicate absolute measures in poverty in less than a generation. Perhaps I can't think of any other example which of a country of that large a size, which had, in fact, its poverty performance in measures for whatever data one can trust, of course, was far worse than India in the 1980s, but it did phenomenal transformation. The other example I was talking about from the universities in the Chinese context, where there was a political will created a space for the rise of those institutions, is the telephone, sorry, is the mobile phone industry. So Chinese firms were not at all in any way leaders in the manufacturing of mobile phones and companies. And you have now some of the top firms in terms of both market share and technological advancement that Chinese firms have. In the other change, which, as Francia was saying about what's happening currently, which may be worth looking at, is the EV market, the electric vehicle market. And China is now sort of acing that completely in its sort of domestic market. So and a lot of times this question is asked. There are a lot of differences between the civilizational almost differences between the China and sort of India story, and it's sort of very confusing and in some cases difficult to compare these two countries in any regard, apart from looking at their approaches to common challenges. I mean, both countries had common challenges in terms of poverty, huge dependence on agriculture, a lot of those issues. But what you would find to be of very much of interest is that both countries, having a huge and large population base, always had the opportunity to make changes within, that is, in the internal scheme of things in their domestic market, and then sort of branch outwards. And I think China's case is particularly unique in that regard. It brought a lot of its change within the country first. Beijing had a huge pollution problem, much like Delhi has it now. In fact, it was not a space one could even travel to because of the nature of poor air quality. And you have now a scenario in Beijing that it's sort of in less than 10 years again completely addressed and sort of redone that problem. In fact, if anybody was to go into Beijing and say that this city had an air pollution problem, one cannot really imagine that, because your lived experience will not sort of be reflective of it. At the same time, India's context in Delhi is that the nature of complex state intervention. Delhi has its own government, its municipality is governed by another party, national government is of another party. There's absolutely no consensus. Everybody acknowledges pollution is a big problem, but to get anything done in order to address it is sort of a nightmare. So it's because of a lot of these things that you find there are issues. There is part two. Let me just sort of, in the interest of also time, mention or ask a little bit about part two of what you would have read. So if you saw in the part two of the reading, there's a discussion particularly of the 1990s. Um, and the 1990s becomes this sorry critical decade where a lot of the states start aligning themselves in performance um, to the neoliberal shift. And while some of the states don't do that well, it starts with that basic premise. I mean, the reading, which is on the unequal acceleration of economic growth, and there is the problems that are imposed by India's sort of pro-business model of development, which also links to the quality of its democratic base and foundation. So, anything an observation from part two, guys? Any reflections? For those who would have not maybe spoken, it'd be good to. Mhm. Part two of the reading. This is talking about the 1990s and beyond, based on what you would have read. Mhm. Yes, Charlie, please.
I think what's interesting for me when it was talking about the 90s was the role that globalization starts to really play, and the impact of sort of external events. I'm thinking of when it talks about the fall of the Soviet Union, and that's sort of forcing India to look elsewhere for a lot of key exports and imports. So I thought it was just really interesting to see, whereas before where in the first part of the reading it seemed to be more internal shifts, the second part definitely had that more of that globalization, the role of globalization in it. And I thought that was very interesting.
Okay. Anyone else? Anything? Mm, no? What is this discussion of a two-track democracy that the author sort of talks about? Anything that anybody read or came across? Mm-hmm. See, one major factor that needs to be kept in mind, particularly for large countries and those with a different political setup, whether a more federal setup or one which is increasingly more decentralized, is to make sense of divergence. And there is always divergence, and it's an inevitability with the performative level of growth. You know, one one critical factor of how to make sense of diverging growth performance is to look into the stories of each of those entities more closely. And while it is tempting, and I think this is where the economist's curse sort of comes in the economics of growth, there is often a tendency to look at macro factors more acutely. By macro, I mean like the larger, broad scoped aggregates. How is it doing on GDP? How is it doing on inflation? How is it doing on employment, unemployment? But all of these being measured at a macro level. The micro picture or the grassroots picture sometimes gets sort of quite extensively or acutely ignored, and that creates its own string of problems. What you do realize, and for those who have not, I think, been able to read through this, and I would urge you to do that. I mean, the whole point of this course was to make students more aware of these two major countries, right, which are now part of the global almost leadership architecture. The point that Francia made about the US acting the way US is under Trump, and that making other countries who would have otherwise not been seen as allies to come together and address things, are sort of a part of a reflection of a multi-aligned or multipolar world order, which is going to, over a period of time, see a new wave of multilateralism, which is not anchored by the EU or US dominated institutional foundation. What was established with the Bretton Woods in the 1940s. That institutional foundation is more or less dead as we speak. So what is now happening is that within the churn we are seeing is a new strand of multi-aligned and multipolar relationship. It may be completely okay for countries to align on certain issues where it suits their national interests, while on a certain other issues they may not see eye to eye on much for much of the time. One such very interesting institutional network such as this is the Quad. I don't know if some of you are aware of. Is anybody aware of the Quad? QUAD. You can look it up. Maybe. It was a setup between, I think, India, the US, Australia, and Japan, if I'm correct. These four countries coming together, and the idea was just simply to collaborate and work on issues where they can have a China minus sort of strategy to collaborate on critical issues. The US sort of anchored this to take on China and sort of partner closely with Japan, Australia, and India. But the Quad, as we speak, it's a very sort of a soft plurilateral institutional arrangement. There is no in that sort of multi-aligned relationship, everything is based on the convenience of what each leader may want to do at what point of time, and which is why there is less of a binding effect of these institutional arrangements. You have the BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. BRICS has been threatening, Trump a lot. He's sort of coming hard at BRICS for sort of announcing just these absolutely, sort of ad hoc tariff measures. But BRICS, in their own sense of institutional, I mean, apart from the projected rhetorical sort of coalition, on the ground, you don't see each of these countries again seeing eye to eye on most issues. I mean, you'd find, for example, India's own relationship with South Africa, or for that matter, China, because the main country within the BRICS entity would be China. Each of these countries have a very sort of a mixed relationship with the Chinese, and that adds to a lot of issues at a sort of a global or a regional plurilateral level. Um, so there is divergence. I mean, what the larger point here is that the divergence in performance as a result of the nature of shifts being seen exogenously, that is external to the process, outside the control of countries, and those where they're making certain shifts, like you may have a national policy shift, but states in the country may see adopting those changes, if at all, or maybe not at all, and not growing at the same level, or finding themselves in position different spaces. And the idea there is for each researcher, and especially for those studying, I think, international development, is to understand how do you make sense of that divergence, or what causes that divergence, or to what extent can you understand that in a context dependent manner, is extremely critical. And I think that is something which I hope, with these two particular stories of at least India and China, as you read more on them, you take that more seriously, because these two countries, as much as they signify progress in the 21st century, driven by factors that were not sort of recognizable 50 years back, um, they are also stories of divergences in growth performance, economic performance, social performance. China has an extremely poor performative record on minority rights issues. India's has been out as bad as China, but it's perhaps sort of in the last sort of 8 to 10 years is not doing anything good in that part as well. But it still, at the end of the day, has such high level of ethno-linguistic fragmentation and diversity that um, divergences will be natural and inevitable amongst communities and also states. So let me just, in the again interest of time, move forward with two critical challenges that I had not spoken about in the last recording. I'd spoken of the first two at more length, which were the sectoral performance gap in the Indian economy, the over sort of performative space for agriculture, but you do see that the growth generating sector tends to be services in context to India for much of the post 90s period. Manufacturing gets more or less ignored. The issue of public debt in banking, um, which has accumulated over a period of time. A lot of the crisis in the banking sector, particularly the public banking sector, can be traced back to issues on both the liability and the asset side. So for banks, their liability includes deposits, which people keep. So if deposit growth is lowering, which is more lesser and lesser people are depositing more money, so that affects banks' sort of capital adequacy requirements. On assets, banks' assets are the loans it lends out, and the quality of these loans, if they're not good, more and more people are defaulting on their debts or are delaying or not repaying their loans. These loans will turn into bad loans, or in some cases, what are defined as non-performing assets. So you do have a loan, but you don't get really much return on that loan lent out. And the public sector banks in India, which sort of have 70 to 80% of sort of bank infrastructural presence in the country, have experienced a huge proliferation in the rise of NPAs. There was an insolvency and bankruptcy code, which, as by law, was sort of brought in by the government to sort of try to help banks recover and reduce some of these NPA issues, but it has had a mixed effect so far. I mean, still banks are struggling in most cases at giving you the numbers. And what it has done is it's made banks, even those with good capital presence, the private sector banks, most of the private sector banks have pretty large capital presence, but there is a high element of risk in lending, which many banks are no longer very comfortable in sort of entertaining. And without risk, or without credit, or without the cheaper availability of credit, businesses either cannot start, they either cannot, in some cases, grow or expand. It's credit is the sort of life engine of the economy at large. You have macro employment challenges, which is across sectors that you would speak or see, and I think that's where we wanted to spend a little bit of time today. And I'll quickly show a few sort of points of numbers that help us understand where and how the employment scenario looks like. So if you would see the population, guys, you're all here, right? If I could just get a yes. Steph, you're here. Carl, you're here.
Yep, we're here.
Okay, great, great, great. So the population segregation, it's interesting because I mentioned this very briefly in the recording before closing that lecture off, that if you look at the population composition in the Indian context, it's entirely a rural village sort of driven network of people living across non or semi-urban areas, non-urban or semi-urban areas. And many of those sort of requirements, as of what you see between the rural and the urban segment, is a product of what you see in how the Indian economy has always been, or the Indian demographic landscape has always been. You have a majority of the population living in the rural areas, but most of the investment, most of the availability of jobs, organized jobs, and what would be seen as growth creating segments of the economy is all in the urban areas. And that is the one major divergence that is important to acknowledge, which is the rural doesn't connect that well with the urban doesn't well connect with the rural. It's not, again, also a very Indian feature. It's a problem which many emerging countries, emerging market economies have. But in the Indian context, this issue of divergence is extremely stark, not just economically, sociologically as well, and now to a certain extent, even politically. To be politically relevant in India, you have to have a large rural presence and base. You can, no matter how articulate or eloquent you are, or well qualified you are, that would have no or hardly any bearing on your electoral capabilities to win elections. And it's because the numbers are all mostly in rural spaces. At the same time, if you look at the sector-wise employment composition, I want you to look at this chart and tell me what and if anything that you find here which is interesting for you to observe. Because some of you are all sort of, I mean, most of you are coming with different country sort of representative examples and sort of knowledge systems. So what do you find here in the sector? These are the sectors which have been creating the sort of higher presence of workforce, where jobs are there, or either otherwise people are working in these sectors in the economy. So how do you interpret what you see in the representation of different demographic uh, presence in these sectors? Okay. Any observations, guys, on the chart that you see? Or yes, Des and Mary.
Hi. There's like a stark or very apparent number or percentage of rural female in the agriculture sector, which I find surprising in a way because I am expecting agriculture sector would be more of manual labor, and that would mostly be done by males. So it makes me sort of wonder uh, what's the makeup of this sector? Why are most female working in this sector?
Which is the agricultural sector?
Yes.
Yes, okay, I'll come to that. Mary, Mary Pat.
I had also like Des thought about the agriculture sector because it just seems so like disproportionately rural women and then rural men, but to me that made a little bit more sense having kind of a little bit of a geography background in my undergrad because we talked about like um gender roles connected to agriculture and how more women might be have fewer job opportunities and literacy rates and all that. So the jobs are more like on the land and collecting water and dealing with the food and picking crops. So that just seemed to make a little bit more sense, and especially that it would be consolidated in the rural areas. So yeah, I was just interested by that, and to me it seems more like
Anything interesting in, so if you move outside agriculture,
Mhm.
transport, communications, hotel, construction, all of these sectors seem to have extremely low participation of women, but a very high presence of, let's say, I mean, transport and communications, you do see urban female composition to be higher. But if you look across the board in sectors like construction, what you'd find that in the post 1990s, and that's the important story here is connected to what Mary Pat was saying and what Des earlier sort of indicated. So agriculture sector is predominantly what you see is the main occupational um, sort of space or sector of work in rural areas. And one major issue which explains the economic geography of these areas demographically and also in terms of sectoral occupation is the fact that you have extremely little or marginal presence of non-agricultural jobs. So even in fact in the employment data that is collected in India, there is farm employment and there are non-farm employment opportunities. So there are two categories, and non-farm employment generally means is the idea to segregate that was to understand how many jobs were coming outside the agricultural sector, and the rural picture is extremely and quite dismal in that regard, which means that most of the workers in extremely vulnerable and precarious conditions are engaged in agricultural sector. Now it's very interesting because a person who is designated as a farmer and someone who's actually doing farming may not be the same people. So you have a lot of very high ownership of land amongst those who you would seen as farmers on paper, but they actually rent out sort of the land to peasants and what you'd consider as workers on the who are engaged in farming, and a very disproportionately high amount of those working on the land or those actually doing farming or working on the land of women. In fact, that number would not be less than around 85 to 90%. That's how big of the chunk of women, rural women are engaged in farming. Uh, and out of that 85 to 90% of those engaged in the farming process are doing farming not for, in many cases, for money, but in most cases as part of unpaid work, because they're a lot of them are doing work to help family and it's part of the intra household sort of work and care needs, and at the same time you don't have alternative opportunities. Male farmers who are engaged in actual farming are also in a similar plight. So you have a huge migration of rural communities traveling across the year in different parts of the country to actually engage in farming practices to earn money and then sort of return back to a native a place where they may otherwise not have access to any employment or job. So you have from states like Bihar and UP a huge tranche of workforce engaged in sort of rural agricultural work in other states, and they tend to be absorbed there. At the same time, you have spaces like manufacturing, which have not seen that higher representation of work um, or growth of work in that sense. Most of the jobs created in the last 30 years have been in construction. And then then you see areas like transport, communication, utilities, and other things growing in importance. Now, if you look at, for example, in a similar light, labor force participation rate, the actual labor force participation rate over time, as in how many people are actually formally entering the workforce, has reduced. It's less than 50%. And this is pre-pandemic numbers. So post-pandemic, the scenario is only worsened because of the nature of shocks the pandemic sort of imposed. And the women labor force participation rate is actually lower than 35 to 36%. Which means that out of 100 jobs, only 35 of the organized sector jobs out of those 100 are featuring women in work. So this is a big, I mean, this is a big issue. Productivity, I've been mentioning that it's a big concern for workforce, existing workforce across sectors. The nature of productivity of workers is measured by different indicators. A basic thing is to be able to look at how much of income that is being earned is, or output that is being produced is conditional upon what hours of work, um, and that is an important realization. If you look at the unemployment numbers, you'll see that the unemployment story in India, particularly amongst the urban areas, has been increasing. Now, that has been the troubling part of the story, because job creation since the 1990s have happened mostly in urban areas, and people in the rural areas were migrating a lot to the urban spaces for jobs. In fact, in many cases, jobs that they otherwise may not even do in their native areas and villages, like in sanitation or public utilities. But even those jobs have been declining in importance. This is an important, I think, chart which I often tend to sort of bring out, which is very critical in the Indian story at this current point as well as we speak, which is the unemployment sort of number on advanced, or people with advanced education, postgraduate education or graduate education is the highest in the country at this point. The more educated you are, the more likely that you're going to be in an unemployed category of workers. There are a number of reasons for it. It's not a very clear, straight sort of formulaic. There is no straight formulaic answer to it. One is there is a huge mismatch between the industry and what the academia sort of produces. The education that people have versus the jobs that are being created and available, the mismatch between that. Second is also now a changing expectation and aspiration amongst those looking for organized sector work. In some cases, many workers demand or need flexibility. They're not able to get that with the organized sector jobs, and may choose to remain sort of frictionally more unemployed than or work in the sort of more informal space, or the self-employed space than seek and solicit a job. But a large part of that story is also that there are not enough organized sector jobs which are securing employment needs and aspirations of graduated folks. And I think that has been the real sort of a crisis point in the Indian labor market in the last 10 years, particularly since 2016, where if you'll see that numbers start really jumping up for unemployment. India's problem usually used to in labor market be of underemployment, not of unemployment. There were more people on the farm doing exactly the same work than they were needed, because there were no alternative employment opportunities, right? And that was much more so part of the story. But the unemployment story was not really as bad as it seems to be now, particularly amongst this. The other key feature which personifies and in a certain sense explains India's sort of labor market composition is the nature of vulnerable employment that it has. And that is been a key feature and a key issue as well. I mean, you have um, a concern or a problem which is with reference to high proportion of vulnerable employment that is between, if you see the period of time between um, 2000 to 2017-18, the overall number of people who are in unsecured sort of jobs, we don't have social security, insurance, any of these sort of basic employment safety needs. There are more than 80% of those people in vulnerable jobs. That's as high the number that you can see. China had over 50% of those in the vulnerable category, let's say starting 2000s, and now have less than 30%, which means that it has addressed, acknowledged, and sort of targeted this as a problem. It has reduced people with jobs which were not secured, which did not have insurance, which did not have a good safety net. And in the Indian context, that problem has hardly been either acknowledged or addressed. And I think that has been a big concern with employment. The other issues of wages, for those sort of aware, I mean, wages are important to study because you may have a job, but which is, I mean, now in much of the industrialized West, the concern is clearly not having just the job that you need, but whether you're able to get by, be able to afford basic sort of needs, or be able to have expenses covered or managed with just one job. So you need all these side hustles to sort of make over. And that is, I think, a concern in the Indian scenario as well. You have lowering of wages. You may have, in some cases, a job where you are just paid maybe over a month, roughly what, 15 to 20,000 rupees. That will be hardly what, 200 or 300 Canadian dollars. So if you're being paid for a month 250 to 350 Canadian dollars, you can imagine the ability of people to sort of have their expenses covered. And working hours are not like as flexible as it seems to be here. I mean, you have people who are expected to be at work at like 8 a.m. I mean, think of a a person who's working as a security worker would have 12-hour, 14-hour shifts and maybe paid maximum 250 to 300 Canadian dollars. So that the adjusted for inflation sort of wage rate has not been growing at the same pace. In fact, expenses and the prices of essential goods and services growing at a much faster pace than wage growth itself. And this has been, I think, a major issue. The two, three issues that I'm talking about: high unemployment amongst advanced education and people with advanced education, a greater amount of exposure to vulnerable employment, and lowering of wages. All these sort of issues are sort of really adding up. In case of gendered segregation labor market, as I've mentioned about women and men, I wanted to again just sort of look at this particular chart, both of these one by one. And I want you to just tell me what you really observe and understand by looking at this. I mean, this is in context, of course, India. The second chart compares India with other South Asian economies. But any thoughts or reflections on what you see here? Yeah, Peter?
I'm just kind of curious. The previous chart seemed to show that women were a very high proportion of those employed in the transportation and communication industry, but here they seem to be quite low.
Yeah, I mean, so transportation, in the scheme of things of what I had mentioned earlier, is I think the overall transport and the sort of transport and communications as a whole would have a different, I think, conceptual terminology. Meaning, I think I have to look into where transport and communication includes more people. My sense is that it also includes utilities into the market. Here, it is just for sort of transport network per se, which is predominantly a male-dominated labor market scenario. I mean, if you were to look at public transport, like I've been seeing in a short trip to New York and New Jersey, in these areas, I was able to see a huge and higher representation now of women bus drivers and people as part of the transport system that you would not find still in the Indian context, much so not just in the north, but generally within the country. So transport sector itself is very male dominated. I think communications would include also utilities and some other sectors. So that's why the numbers might look very stark or different. Francia?
Yeah, I did my first year, I did statistical analysis about women, the correlation between women in India and education.
Oh,
And
wonderful.
I think this demonstrates. So in my findings, what happened was is how many percentage of girls um, finish high school, how many percentage actually make it to higher education, how many stay in higher education or reach other levels of education, and sort of like, and then that goes to related to joining the workforce. And the thing is, most girls finish primary, which is quite high. But then after they do have like certain ages, right? So like 15, 16, you see the decline of staying in high school. And you also see that they stop high school. And so the percentage of women who finish high school or even make it to higher ed is a lot smaller and lower. And there is a correlation between that and most of them at 15, 16, they get married. And so what they do is they have family, they stay in the home, and it's a lot harder for them depending on the number of children, which was also another correlation. Depending on the number of children, it's harder for them to either finish school or join higher, more technical jobs. So we find out that the longer a girl stayed in school, and the more she delayed marriage, or the more she delayed having children, the more the percentage increase in terms of that population, part of the population joining higher education like university and college and finishing, and joining workforces that were more, skilled labor force, part of the labor force. And then, so you see a lot of the women, because either they decided to stop high school or not finish high school, they joined the agricultural sector mode, which is why you see that huge percentage of female working in the agricultural sectors. Again, related to education levels, or because either, like as I mentioned, either they get married early, younger, and they start having family younger, and then they, depending on the number of children, it is harder for them to finish their education or join other more skilled labor. So they will stay within agricultural or those type of jobs. And those were sort of the finding of the study, but then I can see here, based on these numbers, sort of a correlation with that. So I'm sure there's other factors as well,
Of course.
definitely, but I think education is a big one.
Mhm. Yeah, no, fascinating. And in fact, I'll mention of a scholar whose work you or anyone interested can follow more closely. And a center which we collaborate very closely on, Center for Economic Data Analysis, which does some very basic, interesting work. But the scholars whose name I'm sort of putting here is a scholar by the name of Professor Ashwini Deshpande. She also has been a collaborator on some studies and projects that Center had earlier taken by commenting on that work. I'm just sharing her name here with a link. And Francie, you might find some of her work, recent work, particularly on labor force participation rate, very interesting. So it's really, I mean, there, apart from, I think so I mean, Ashwini's point has been very interesting. She has been taking a sort of a slightly contrarian position to the mainstream gender discourse, that the sociological cultural factors play a huge role in inhibiting women to be part of the organized workforce space. Her, I think, argument with data that she has been sort of working on has been on explaining a lack of good jobs for women. And her argument is that it's not, the issue is not of demand. It is, the issue is mostly of supply. So there is enough demand for good jobs for women, which they are willing to sort of undertake and sort of be part of the workforce. And the evidence of that is because they're not able to get that. A lot of them are settling for more vulnerable, informal, unorganized jobs. And I stand to agree with much of that story based on my own sort of ethnographic work across different communities in India, and also, I mean, the one major issue of my work in Cambodia that was very, very insightful was to see how more and more women were assertively part of the workforce in both employment in vulnerable sectors as street vendors, let's say, but also in organized sector employment. In the Indian scenario, you'll find that it's mostly vulnerable and unproductive sectors, so as to speak, which are unorganized and more vulnerable in terms of lack of social security, safety nets, things like that. You miss a day's work as a daily wage, you don't get paid, and you have all sorts of issues. There are areas, sectors like health and education, where participation of women is as much same as men, but they are too also the most underfunded sectors by the government. Government spends at the least of around, the national government spends less than 2% or 3% of its overall GDP on health. And education, the numbers are not even inspiring at all. And I was just mentioning about the education issue. Trade, construction are the two main job creating sectors. Post 90s, this is where a lot of the jobs were created, where people moved from rural to urban areas. Transport here, this is strictly transport. And all of these sectors you see in the Indian context are predominantly dominated by men. And what Ashwini's point has been, which is I think fair, is that these sectors are creating jobs by their own very design, which are absorbing more men. So even if more women want to be part of those spaces, they're not getting a chance. So if you look at health and education and IT, BPO, communication, utilities, some of those sectors you will find more women working, and so the inhibiting fact of sociological, cultural factors is not in entirety explaining the labor force participation story. There are, of course, other issues, which is in terms of uh, the nature of employment that you see amongst women at the age of 25 and then 30 and 35, and that there is a shift that is happening across the board in those 10 years because of the choices women are making. And those I think the area of body of work in that regard is growing, and there's some very interesting work within India that's coming out now from especially emerging scholars and in that demographic group. So it's a fascinating area. I'm so glad that you'd looked at this as something very closely as a project earlier. So it's helpful. I did see, I think it was it was Marilis. Do you want to sort of go ahead, please?
Yeah,
Raise your
I
hand, yeah.
wanted to cover whatever the previous person spoke, but like even I am an Indian, I'm from the South India. So as a child, I was told that education, like, and becoming a nurse or something was ideal to a woman because in education field, when you go to work at 9 and come back at 5 p.m. in the evening, and you can serve your family, and in health you are naturally like you are built to be a mother, or you are built to take care of somebody. So it was like that. Even I was brought up like that. So it's not it's very surprising to see that women are not around in trade, construction, manufacturing, because they are more capable of doing works also. So that's what I wanted to share.
Yeah, no, so there, you're right. Well, so that's where I'm saying that the scholars' work is helping us explain this exact that dichotomy that you're talking about, which is that the issue is on the supply side, that there are not many jobs which are taking more women, in fact, including in these sectors. And I gave the example of New York, for example, right? Like, which I was very closely observing this over the week I've been there, which is that in transport, and I spoke to someone who's in the city government, that they made a conscious effort to hire more women across different functioning departments. And that changed the participation, of course, of women, because there's a conscious choice of will to be able to do that by design. And I think that's a big concern in the Indian context. Now, you see, for example, other countries within South Asia, I mean, except Afghanistan and probably to a certain extent Pakistan, every other country has a higher participation of women in their workforce level. Bangladesh, a country which consciously made that effort in the last sort of 15 years across sectors, saw dividends of that. It's been well documented now in literature. Nepal, Myanmar, Bhutan, all of these countries have higher participation of women in the main sort of workforce. And these are all organized sort of job statistics. So, I mean, of course, it doesn't cover the informality. In the informality story in India, you will find a reverse statistic. You will find more women in every particular sector, but they're in stages of extreme vulnerability and precarity in terms of working conditions and conditions. You look at domestic care industry, you'll be there. So cultural sociological factors have a very important role and say, but what Ashwini's work and I am saying that, and I think what it has happened is in the last few years, I've been saying that a lot of the research which is coming in this demand supply side labor market assessment scenario, it's bringing out very interesting insights that it's not simply always about what's happening inside the house, which is driving the story. It's also a lot about how the market design is, and the institutional and also the state will, political will, to be able to address those issues. Yes, Francia, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to share that a very interesting use case also for like a catalyst event that happened that sort of changed things a little bit. So if you think about, and this is to India, if you think about the tsunami that happened in Sri Lanka back in 2004, it was a bit of a catalyst for a shift on like we're talking about these gender roles and tied to the labor force and so on. So what happened was that, because of the tsunami hit and so on, so women saw themselves in increased vulnerability, right, due to the disproportionate death tolls and loss of livelihoods. And then because of that, you saw in foreign aid and foreign intervention in a way a little bit, you saw women taking on the trades and women becoming entrepreneurs, sorry, in order to rebuild their communities. So I thought that was very interesting because there was a lot of, for instance, at the time I was Niagara College had a program going for women entrepreneurship in India and Sri Lanka shortly after the 2004 tsunami to help women sort of integrate themselves in the workforce and the trades especially, and receive trades training again to help rebuild their community. And I think that has sparked something where you started seeing other communities more inspired, like, it's like kind of viewing it in a way that we don't have to have a natural disaster happen in order to jump into opening up the possibilities for deviating from the standard, like as my classmate was saying, just nurse or mother. So deviating from that and opening up the doors for women to enter other sectors of the workforce, like becoming entrepreneurs, carpenting, plumbing, electricity, and things like that. So I think it's there. And I think it's still, like, as you mentioned in other classes, protesting and women advocating in India more and more to open up more other doors to other type of employment. So I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah. No, this is fascinating, and thank you for sharing that insight, because yeah, I mean, the scenario is changing. The fact there's more research coming out, I think it explains partially the kind of greater advocacy now being made for the kind of interventions that the state needs to make. There is clearly now in electoral conversations a lot more of discussions around, quote unquote, the women vote, and getting and securing the women vote, which means that as a larger constituency of the vote, there's a huge, in the data of electoral participation, in Indian elections, women are out numbering men in the actual numbers, which means that clearly you have no choice but to listen to the needs of women. They're half the population, so it's not like there is a there's a process of othering that one can sort of incorporate in that regard, as previously being the case. But there is a greater sense of participation now in much of the discussions. The link which I just shared with you guys, along with this working paper, which you may find very interesting. And the working paper actually in its own title is sort of reflecting on what we were just discussing, which is what is really happening with the labor force participation story in the Indian context, whether they're women who are dropping out because of whatever reasons that may be the case, or they're being pushed out, or they're just finding it difficult to get in. And it's in some cases the answer is all three, but the labor market design is such that being pushed out or getting in itself is very difficult. And I think that has been the major problem in the Indian context so far. But I stand to agree. I think there's a lot of change that now is happening, which by the very fact that we are discussing a lot of these things make a huge point of relevance. Of course, salaried and wage workers, I mean, China and India sort of story does not in any way match. I mean, India has less than 20% of its salaried workforce of women, which means that 80% of the women are working in the unorganized informal sector by the existing current data. While in China, you have more than 60 to 70% now of the women working in organized sector jobs. So I mean, that's a big area of intervention which the Chinese did. I mean, that's the confidence that people enjoy despite having a more repressive, sort of an anti-civic freedom enshrined political party, why people sort of stay and are quote unquote adaptively comfortable with that in the China context is because of the nature of state employment, state society contract that is built around nature of employment needs. Employment has taken care, and the better possibility of employment has taken care for the citizenry at large to be relatively be content with the status quo of the political party. And whenever there is a disruption to that, whenever there's a loss of jobs, whenever there is a lack of jobs being available to those entering the workforce, the discontent increases, and that's what triggers the people to take a more sort of contrarian position. The government in the Indian scenario, I think the issue being the issue that it is, has not still got that much of attention as it should. Inequities in nourishment levels, I mean, this is it's like I can sort of go on with this for at least a few weeks, which is, if you look at the statewide picture on undernourishment in the Indian context, the northern and the central states, the situation has been deplorable. You still have around, I think, roughly 70 to 80 million kids who still don't get sufficient nutrition for the day. And that's a very high population of kids suffering from some level of undernourishment. The issue of undernourishment is not simply about lack of access to food. One has to understand that it's not about lack of access to food, which is principally causing this. As I've sort of seen, and when we've been part of surveys, we've seen that a lot of this problem has to do with the right and correct dietary habits and preferences, which are lacking in many rural centers and particularly tribal belts and areas where indigenous communities are also residing. And that has caused the undernourishment problem to worsen. What people are eating versus what they should be having to stay more adequately nourished. A lot of cases that is connected to also the problem of undernourished mothers or those in advanced stages of pregnancy not having enough nourishment, and then sort of giving birth to kids who have sort of malnourishment from the very sort of initial stage of birth. The government expenditure across states on basic things like health and education has been very low. I mean, the numbers on health expenditure touching 4.5, I think, of GDP. This I think this was the scenario 2014-15, which you see the data. I think now overall data suggests it's come down drastically to around somewhere 3.53. The national government's perspective has been the states have to do more. State government's perspective is the national government needs to release more funds to states for states to do more, and that federal, I think, friction has caused healthcare expenditure to work. What it has done, unfortunately, is that it has created a whole private industry of capital investment, much like what you see in the US, but which is that out-of-pocket healthcare expenditure has drastically been high, even if it appears that from this chart that it is reducing 60 to 62% of out-of-pocket healthcare expenditure. That is, for every $100 that is spent, 62 of those dollars are coming out of pocket from a person. So imagine the amount of money that a person spends on healthcare when there is a crisis or shock. And because since still a lot of people stay within families and they still reside in rural and semi-urban areas with more people in the intra-household level, anybody who faces a healthcare emergency just sees a complete dilution of disposable income and funds for the income earner in the household. And that's been a big issue. The COVID pandemic exposed this crisis in the worst of possible ways. A lot of families entered into deeper cycles of debt because of very high or uninsured out-of-pocket healthcare expenditure. I'll talk about the China picture when we look at the Chinese example. Education, as I said earlier, again, if you look at the numbers in terms of percentage of overall income and growth that the government spends, it's still less than 3.5 to 4%. You have declining sort of public revenue expenditures. I see that Canada is experiencing a very similar plight now when it comes to declining public revenue expenditure on education. It's very similar to what the UK saw 10 years back, and somewhere sort of the Canada story is now reminiscent of that, which will only give way to more private institutions and higher costs of sort of tuition fees living. But if you have a scenario which I was saying of higher unemployment amongst those with higher education, you'll find that people will be lesser and less intrinsically motivated to get higher education as well, and maybe be more happy with secondary and sort of initial basic tertiary education. With that, I'll bring sort of our conversation in India to a close, at least for now, and of course we'll keep sort of coming back to this